Oh, hello Internet! This is the next in my series of videos on Hannah Arendt's Between Past and Future, and this one has been a long time coming. If you've watched the very first video on the crisis in education, then I said even then that it was the third and fourth essays that really interested me. Here we are, nearly 3 years later, with What is Authority? The title of the essay also functioning as the primary question it's going to ask. Arendt does give a fairly brief answer early on in the essay, but she spends the rest of the length investigating it from first principles. Going back to reread it, I was again struck by the immense scale of the task and the intricate historical approach which she takes. To be sure, I am not fully qualified to judge that she has indeed covered every available angle, and doubtless she has not, but we can at least clearly see her intended process. And it is a familiar process. She starts with the Greeks and she works forward from there. The essay is in 6 parts, which nominally break into stages of development in Western concepts of authority. Because of the claim that he was the progenitor of this tradition, the shadow of Plato looms large over the whole enterprise, but Arendt does not seem to be holding him up as an icon. She is clear that the purpose for this investigation is to provide us the clearest perspective for critique of the past and to thus chart a course for the future. One thing I'm going to mildly disagree with Arendt on is that the fullest treatment of the Western tradition should include Persian and Islamic culture. There is room for disagreement here and grey area to be sure, but it seems to me that this culture is tied every bit as much to Europe as it is to its other neighbours, India and Africa. And furthermore, Islam is a sibling of the monotheistic religions. This is not to say that there is no value in studying the Far West, however. Even though Judaic tradition comes from the Middle East, and so did Christ, but yeah. Honestly though, who am I to question the limitations that Arendt has chosen to put on her already considerable historical study? Nonetheless, I would be interested. For a start, the concept of law goes back much further than Plato, and this is only one aspect of the evolution of early Western empires, even if they were not strictly yet polities, as Arendt will define it from the Greek model. The first section frames up the discussion, and Arendt begins by claiming unambiguously that traditional Western authority is over. The modern loss of certainty, beginning around the time of Descartes, led first to the loss of religion, then the loss of tradition, and now the loss of the very political authority of states itself, as the self-evident right of rulers to rule is called into question. And this is what led to the rise of totalitarianism as a new form of government. The most significant symptom of the crisis is that it has spread to such pre-political areas as child-rearing and education, where authority is obviously required as much by natural needs, the helplessness of the child, as by political necessity, the continuity of an established civilization. This form of authority has, throughout the history of political thought, served as a model for a great variety of authoritarian forms of government, so that the loss of this natural authority means that practically, as well as theoretically, we are no longer in a position to know what authority really is. Arendt says she will not be considering authority in general, but specifically the Western version of authority, which she traces to Plato, and she will begin her investigation from there. First, though, she wants to be clear what authority never was. And right at the start of the essay, we get this absolutely pivotal distinction. Since authority always demands obedience, it is commonly mistaken for some form of power or violence. Yet authority precludes the use of an external means of coercion. Where force is used, authority itself has failed. Authority, on the other hand, is incompatible with persuasion, which presupposes equality and works through a process of argumentation. Where arguments are used, authority is left in abeyance. Against the egalitarian order of persuasion stands the authoritarian order, which is always hierarchical. If authority is to be defined at all, then it must be in contradistinction to both coercion by force and persuasion through arguments. So if you are a regular viewer, you will know I'm partial to a spatial metaphor, and I will be presenting some here. I will give time codes to skip them, but they do inform my reading of the text. Arendt is fairly clearly giving us a duality between egalitarianism, which is ordered according to persuasion, and authoritarianism, which is ordered according to hierarchy. Outside of this duality stands coercion, which is ordered by violence and is implicitly undesirable. Arendt says that when force is used, authority has failed, but when persuasion is used, it is merely left in abeyance. By the way, hierarchy to Arendt here seems to be quite a rigid, even caste-like mentality which everybody intrinsically recognizes, i.e. is not persuaded into. This is authoritarianism after all, but Arendt is not slavishly committed to any authoritarian model. However, it was in opposition of egalitarianism and the avoidance of violence that Plato sought to create his political authority. Now I'm going to quite arbitrarily impose a horseshoe structure on this spectrum. Egalitarianism is equally distributed power, and authoritarianism is hierarchically graduated power. This is the left and the right of the spectrum, but the spectrum is now deformed towards coercion to the extent that the most extreme on either side will tend towards moral certitude and an ends justify the means mindset. Again, let me stress this is a metaphor. It does not prove that, for example, one cannot be strongly on either side without being morally certain, although a conclusion like this is the rather cynical implication of the horseshoe model as an empirical hypothesis. However, this horseshoe does seem to reflect Arendt's description of liberal and conservative confusions, which we will see below. In an Arendtian context, I think that the more one relies on coercion in government as opposed to authority, the more tyrannical the government becomes, leading eventually to totalitarianism, and this in proportion to the narrowness of its vision. Going back to the general model, authority is the last of three pillars to fall, heralding the end of the modern age: religion, tradition, and authority, the Roman political trinity upon which the political and therefore public space was constructed. The loss of certainty took each one in turn, but it was not until the fall of authority that the political effects were felt. The general doubt of the modern age also invaded the political realm, where things not only assume a more radical expression, but become endowed with a reality peculiar to the political realm alone. What perhaps hitherto had been of spiritual significance only for the few, now has become a concern for one and all. To tackle this political crisis, or at least to give us some space for discussion, Arendt wishes to make some key distinctions from each of the cultural pillars. Turning first to tradition, she wants to distinguish tradition from the past, and claim that despite, or even because of the loss of tradition, only now will the past open up to us with unexpected freshness and tell us things no one has yet had ears to hear. But it cannot be denied that without a securely anchored tradition, the whole dimension of the past has also been endangered. This dimension of the past is captured by remembrance, and this relates back to the discussion of greatness from the concept of history. Arendt is a heterodox thinker, and she will shortly have very strong words for conservatives, but one thing I feel that she is absolutely with the right wing on is that there can be such a thing as human greatness, and for all that we do see it in cooperative works, such greatness can be manifested by single human individuals. Indeed, who else can possibly manifest it if it is to be remembered as part of a human world? In the same way, the modern introduction of doubt into religion led to the fall of another pillar. Since Pascal, and even more pointedly since Kierkegaard, doubt has been carried into belief, and the modern believer must constantly guard his beliefs against doubts. Christianity, and Judaism of course, in the modern age is ridden by paradoxes and absurdity, and religion cannot survive absurdity. Yet this loss of belief in dogmas of institutional religion need not necessarily imply a loss or even a crisis of faith, for religion and faith, or belief and faith, are by no means the same. Religion is not then identical with faith. The insertion of the word belief into the quote above seems to imply that religion is mere belief, and so it can be sacrificed without the loss of faith. There is the tangential question of the political difference, if any, between a belief and an opinion, but we really can't get into that here. Finally then, Arendt turns to authority to make the same comparison. Authority gave the world the permanence and durability which human beings need precisely because they are mortals. Its loss is tantamount to the loss of the groundwork of the world. But the loss of worldly permanence and reliability, which politically is identical with the loss of authority, does not entail, at least not necessarily, the loss of the human capacity for building, preserving, and caring for a world that can survive us and remain a place fit to live for those who come after us. So the loss of authority then is the loss of permanence and reliability. However, it is not to be identified with the loss of a human capacity for building and order. This last claim is, I think, more tenuous than the other two. Should we just accept that worldly permanence and reliability is politically identical with authority? And how can the loss of that permanence and reliability not undermine the human ability to build order? Even Arendt qualifies her distinction by saying, not necessarily. Having made these three distinctions, though, Arendt also takes the time to explicitly say that such distinctions are important. People seem to believe, she says, that they can proceed on the assumption that everything can eventually be called everything else, a habit which Arendt is clearly frustrated by. This does speak to ideas of postmodernism, but Arendt will accuse both liberals and conservatives of doing this. Thus, in modern political discourse, distinctions are meaningful only to the extent that each of us has the right to define his terms. Yet does not this curious right, which we have come to grant as soon as we deal with matters of importance, as though it were actually the same as the right to one's own opinion, already indicate that such terms as tyranny, authority, totalitarianism have simply lost their common meaning, or that we have ceased to live in a common world? So once we penetrate her rather dense syntax, Arendt is saying that we are not to conflate the right to define one's own terms with the right to one's own opinion. When terms are discussed, they should be agreed upon. This, we can see, of course, characterizes much of the trouble in political discourse today. It is as though we have ceded the possibility of using convergent definitions of terms, and we do not habitually try to find compromises that ensure that the terminology of the discussion is acceptable to both sides. If, in these circumstances, we assure ourselves that we still understand each other, we do not mean that together we understand a world common to us all, but that we understand the consistency of arguing and reasoning, of the process of argumentation in its sheer formality. The analytic process that manipulates the core ideas has become the point of the discourse. This all sounds very laudable as a Platonic ideal, clear light of reason and all that, but in fact it has led us to a mire of petty backbiting and ideological cowardice as we all become afraid to expose the weak points in our positions, and we all have them. It is in this context that everything can become everything else, and Arendt claims that the social political sciences of both liberals and conservatives assume that there is no meaningful otherness. We will not challenge this assertion of distinction denying here, although certainly it should be challenged, but Arendt will spend the rest of part one expanding on two of these distinction denying theories, with the first being covered in much more detail. The first aspect is comparisons of authority against the concept of freedom. Arendt says that liberals, in their explicit quest for increasing freedom and thus reducing power, tend to overlook the difference between authoritarian, tyrannical, and totalitarian forms of government, losing the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate power. She makes the gradation explicit. Authoritarianism supports the restriction of freedom. Tyranny supports the abolition of political freedom, and totalitarianism aims at the elimination of human spontaneity. But the liberal writer, concerned with history and the progress of freedom rather than with forms of government, sees only differences in degree here and ignores that authoritarian government, committed to the restriction of liberty, remains tied to the freedom that it limits to the extent that it would lose its very substance if it abolished it altogether. That is, it would change into tyranny. A legitimate authoritarian government values freedom. It is only when it ceases to value freedom that it becomes tyranny. Recall that as far as Arendt is concerned, authoritarianism is simply the valid opposition to egalitarianism. Tyranny and totalitarianism are implied undesirable effects caused by coercion. The difference is that where the tyrant rules by personal interest and whim, the authoritarian rules by law, or rules by something that can be traced beyond the human, or at least beyond the political realm. Whether we are capable of drawing such a bright line is debatable, but suffice to say that how the laws came to be has a historical component that goes back further than Arendt traces here. The effect of this liberal conflation, though, is that all power is denigrated as inherently corrupting, and thus power is equated with violence. There is a trivial truth to this assertion. Every act I perform in your presence essentially coerces you to witness it. But are we therefore to say that every single act is a violent one? Arendt says certainly not. Looking from the other perspective, though, the conservative takes a very different view on the liberal march toward freedom. The removal of the protective bounds around freedom, inevitable without some kind of authority, will lead to its destruction, and so where the liberal sees progress, the conservative sees an oncoming doom. I want to first give short shrift to any facile liberal response that to protect freedom by limiting it is somehow self-contradictory. And ironically, this works on the anarcho-capitalists as well. We're talking about political freedom here, and we can see from systems in nature that sometimes unrestrained systems can become self-destructive. So the idea of there being some kind of restraint that is beneficial is clearly a valid one. We're now just talking about the extent of restraint. And you can argue for zero restraint if you like, but we're already having that discussion now, aren't we? Indeed, Arendt's point is that nearly all political theories have put the idea of freedom at the very center of their model. However, this time, for the conservative, tyranny and totalitarianism are again identified, except that now totalitarian government, if it is not directly identified with democracy, is seen as its almost inevitable result. That is, the result of the disappearance of all traditionally recognized authorities. Because of the loss of authority, the liberal march toward freedom is perceived as tyrannical in its application, and, just like the liberals, the conservatives now somehow lose the ability to distinguish between tyranny and totalitarianism, and eventually the very process of egalitarianism, democracy, becomes identified in turn as part of the corrupting influence. Arendt wants to frame a way for moving past these problems with three schematic metaphors for authoritarianism, tyranny, and totalitarianism respectively. Authoritarianism she compares to a pyramid, where authority, and therefore power, is at its maximum at the top. This may actually be a single person without that person becoming a tyrant. The existence of the pyramid at all levels is what manifests the hierarchy, and by the nature of pyramids, this hierarchy is directed towards a hypothetical inverted pyramid to which it is geometrically paired. A space of possible pyramids as an idea falls naturally out of this, and this represents all the different interpretations of power in politics and culture that we may observe in the world. Authoritarianism of this type Arendt calls Christian, but I'm not sure about her justification for this. This image can be used only for the Christian type of authoritarian rule as it developed during the Middle Ages, when the focal point above and beyond the earthly pyramid provided the necessary point of reference for the Christian type of equality, the strictly hierarchical nature of life on earth notwithstanding. So, because beyond the focal point is where we find the Christian type of equality, the fact that it is not found here on earth is fine or something? No. At least as far as I can see, if the hierarchy is defined by the linear nature of the pyramid, then if it can be traced at all, then it can be traced beyond the top of the pyramid. That's what the ideal realm is, if we could access that realm, which we can't. So to me, there is nothing intrinsically Christian about this model of authority, but please do correct me about that below. So for convenience, I will use 2D diagrams going forward rather than 3D models for the pyramids and subsequent structures. This does change Arendt's model slightly, especially as I am going to specify what those two dimensions are, but let it be noted that this very idea of multidimensionality does go to show just how complex this situation will become in the real world. The next model, that of tyranny, is characterized as that same pyramid, but every level has been destroyed except the very top, the tyrant, and the very bottom, everyone else. The pyramid has ceased to exist, and so has the hierarchy, and it is part of the nature of this model that the tyrant ceases in some way to be human. They are a wolf in human shape, as Plato and Aristotle put it, and thus everybody else is equal. Arendt says because of this that political theory confidently places tyranny among the egalitarian forms of government. I would like to get a citation on that. I personally could not find one, but it is important to remember that the tyrant is most definitely not a king, which is a much more moderate form of authoritarian. On top of that, let me say that I'm not really buying this second model as a practical possibility for tyranny, and I think it will weaken Arendt's later claim that authority can be decisively separated from tyranny. In any real world of human individuals, barring the most extreme sci-fi, authority must be distributed beyond the single ruler, and thus we are again talking about some kind of pyramid. What I think we can say is that a tyrannical ruler will seek to concentrate power as much as possible, and so this pinches the top of the pyramid somewhat. In the mathematical limit, this will lead to the situation that Arendt describes, but the degree of this pinching is surely one of the political factors that sets the system, and so once again we do not have a clear distinction beyond the pleasing linear structure of the pyramid itself. I would almost go as far as to say that the destroyed pyramid is what ideal totalitarianism really looks like on this model. A totalitarian state, after all, seeks to become a true puppet master. This makes Arendt's own description of totalitarianism more of a qualitative analysis of how such a model could attempt to sustain itself. And on that note, Arendt's model of totalitarianism is, I shit you not, an onion. Now, I don't mean to be dismissive here, and I don't know Arendt's sense of humour. It may have pleased her to use something as banal as this ubiquitous vegetable to represent totalitarianism. The construction of the metaphor, however, is anything but funny. The rulers of a totalitarian cult are at the center of the onion, and they are thus protected from the outside world by successive layers of the organization, and each of these layers refracts reality in a subtle way so that the inner layers are enabled to believe that the rest of the world really does mostly think like them, and at the same time, the most radical ideas of the cult, once they have permeated out through the various layers, appear only a little bit strange to the normies that are not part of the movement at all. Like I say, this does not really fit with the geometric power dynamics of the previous examples, and so I will amend Arendt's model below, but I think this does create a strong narrative for how organizations can become totalitarianism, and let's not forget, Arendt literally wrote the book on that. So I'm going to play with Arendt's schematics now and change her model a little. Please comment below if you think I've misrepresented her or anyone else. The essay will continue at this time code. Simplifying into 2 dimensions though, we're looking at a space of an x-axis of population proportion against a y-axis of amount of power. I'm equivocating here because of course this is just so abstract and simplifying into only 2 dimensions. So, However, with this basis, Arendt calls authoritarianism a pyramid, and she claims that tyranny is the destroyed pyramid where only the apex and the base exist. Furthermore, she claims that this is egalitarianism because the tyrant is rightly excluded from humanity, so the accurate distribution is the flat line of everybody else. I do not really think it's feasible to claim that a tyrant has entirely concentrated power unless they have complete control. So, could we call that total control? What if the destroyed pyramid is rather the consequence of the totalitarian cult centering all decisions, even the spontaneous life decisions of humans, within the control of the leadership icon, and the tyrannical ruler is one who seeks to move in this direction, pinching the pyramid at the top and creating a non-linear gradient? We can thus say that our 3 models would be the pyramid for authoritarianism, the pinched pyramid for tyranny, and the destroyed pyramid for totalitarianism. But we're surely not done there. If the pyramid can be pinched, it can be inflated. As larger amounts of power are held by commensurately higher proportions of the population, the pyramid will be expanded or inflated, first maybe into a hemisphere or some kind of trapezoid, or then, if we put a limit on the relative maximum amount of power, then into some rectangular form as the opposing geometric limit. The rectangular form is clearly not egalitarian as such. There are still some people with the lowest amount of power, but the gradient of the pyramid corners has become infinite at this point. But if you think about it, We could go further still. We could say we want to decrease the number of people who have that minimum amount of power even further. And so the pyramid begins to invert. Maybe then the limit is actually the inverted destroyed pyramid, where everyone in a population has the maximum possible amount of power, except for that one fucking guy. But seriously, fuck that guy, am I right? Or should we be grateful for his sacrifice? And now we have another kind of spectrum. But here if we say, I don't know, that one side is the left and one side is the right of the spectrum, then the middle of the spectrum appears here, where there is a fairly broad spread of the population at each level of power. What exactly distinguishes a left-wing tyranny from a right-wing one is up for debate. No doubt there are some who would claim that they are part of some particularly persecuted minority. Ironically, there are many who would claim that. But I suspect that as coercion becomes increasingly violent, left-wing and right-wing tyrannies become indistinguishable from each other as violence comes to dominate. However, what I think we must still say is that in each case, the form of the model describes a hierarchy, even one as absurd as the solitary totalitarian ruler. And it is for this reason that I think Arendt's association of authoritarianism with hierarchy is not quite correct. All models will include a hierarchy. However, if we continue to grant that authoritarianism is a pyramid, then, as we said above, it is characterized by its linear form. The pyramid is neither pinched nor inflated, but adheres to an easily calculable gradient, so easy that even the uneducated can reliably perceive its validity. And I think this is what Arendt ultimately claims authority is, a form of hierarchy which is precisely calibrated to be as clear as possible to the maximum number of people. But if the pyramid of authority is easy to calculate, then surely so too is the cuboid of equity, and many other polyhedra besides, so there must be more to it than that. The same metaphorical status applies to the onion model of totalitarianism. It serves to show the absurdity of something so contrived and egocentric as the destroyed pyramid, and yet how it can still attempt to apply itself in the real world, even though it will ultimately be unsustainable. The leadership at the center represents the most separated and radical version of the cult, the egocentric core. Then, at each subsequent layer, the members are ideologically driven by their presence to the icon in comparison to the normal world outside. The inner gives them their sense of purpose and meaning, while the outer represents a normal world that is just slightly more radical than them. Thus, each layer, from the rulers to their lieutenants, to the party officials, to the enforcers, to the members, to the sympathizers and unwary, is enabled to, in their active rejection of reality. Each layer forms an ideological gradient of radicalization, and the onion structure makes the system organizationally shockproof against the factuality of the real world. So to this point, we have what Arendt claims is a theory of liberalism and conservatism which rests on several key failures of distinction. She observes that there is ample material for either side to make their case, either progress or dissolution, and so intuitively the truth must be equally distributed between them, which is a rather rash assertion. I think we can more cautiously say that both sides have valid points which overall will cancel out in different areas. However, this might also lead to problems over time because the numerous oscillations in public opinion, which for more than 150 years has swung from a liberal mood to a conservative one and back again, have resulted only in further undermining the distinctive lines between authority and freedom and eventually destroying the political meaning of both. But because liberalism and conservatism were both born in this unstable climate and form a duality, they are both ultimately bound to be concerned with restoration of their preferred form, either of freedom or authority. And if this urge is not very carefully monitored, then it may become committed to the extinction of its opposite number. In both cases, this is what I call monotheistic exceptionalism, the functional acceptance of an icon of good and the implied moral authority that this icon imparts. Or, as Arendt puts it, if one assumes, as both do, that there is such a thing as a historical process with a definable direction and a predictable end, it can obviously land us only in paradise or in hell. And it is this kind of functionalization in politics that Arendt wishes to address with the second distinction-denying theory she tackles. What is the functionalization of politics? It is actually quite similar to the first example. Both liberalism and conservatism make conflation errors for political purpose, which leads to differing skewed perspectives. A convenient instance may be provided by the widespread conviction in the free world today that communism is a new religion, notwithstanding its avowed atheism, because it fulfills socially, psychologically, and emotionally the same function traditional religion fulfilled, and still fulfills in the free world. Their concern is only with functions, and whatever fulfills the same function can, according to this view, be called the same. It is as though I had the right to call the heel of my shoe a hammer because I, like most women, use it to drive nails into the wall. I do so love the bit of cultural history we see in that last sentence, not to mention the sad loss of the cobbler's art. But the conflation in this case is whatever fulfills the function of something is that thing, in this case a religion. And we now see how the conservative and the liberal interpret this in differing ways. Thus, it would be characteristic of conservatism to insist that, after all, a heel is not a hammer, but that the use of the heel as a substitute for the hammer proves that hammers are indispensable. In other words, it will find in the fact that atheism can fulfill the same function as religion the best proof that religion is necessary and recommend the return to true religion as the only way to counter a heresy. The argument is weak, of course. If it is only a question of function and how a thing works, then the adherents of false religion can make as good a case for using theirs as I can for using my heel, which does not work so badly either. The liberals, on the contrary, view the same phenomena as a bad case of treason to the cause of secularism and believe that only true secularism can cure us of the pernicious influence of both false and true religion on politics. In the interest of time, I will skim over Arendt's own apparent conflation of communism with atheism, but it is there, right? Arendt adds that the same kind of functional conflation is made in the case of authority with violence. Authority makes people obey. It is what makes people obey. So if violence makes people obey, then violence is authority. And from there, it is a small but equally mistaken step to authority is violence. And again, we find on one side those who counsel a return to authority because they think only a reintroduction of the order-obedience relationship can master the problems of mass society. And on the other side, we find those who believe that a mass society can rule itself like any other social body. Again, both parties agree on one essential point. Authority is whatever makes people obey. So we have the conflation of tyranny and totalitarianism with authoritarianism, and we have the conflation of authority with violence. And Arendt seems to be unsure if the central claim itself, authority is what makes people obey, is even valid. This validity is, after all, the very purpose of the essay. Again, these lost distinctions lead both liberals and conservatives to false conclusions, but Arendt is going to come harder for the conservatives in the end. I do not believe that atheism is a substitute for or can fulfill the same function as a religion any more than I believe that violence can become a substitute for authority. But if we follow the recommendations of the conservatives, who at this particular moment have a rather good chance of being heard, I am quite convinced that we shall not find it hard to produce such substitutes, and we shall use violence and pretend to have restored authority, or that our rediscovery of the functional usefulness of religion will produce a substitute religion, as though our civilization were not already sufficiently cluttered up with all sorts of pseudo-things and nonsense. Arendt is talking there in the post-war period, where the democratic West was at its most self-congratulatory before the counterculture of the 60s, and this is why she says that conservatives have a good chance of being heard, compared with the revolutionary nature of the earlier modern age, both political and technological. But especially in the quote above, she seems much harder on conservatives overall, and I will be taking her lead on this, although I'm obviously still open to the discussion. Why is she harder on conservatives? It is because of that very revolutionary nature we spoke of. It hasn't changed. The rapid pace of change in life has only intensified, and just because a single radical movement has been put down successfully, that of Nazism, in the 1950s when Arendt was writing this, that does not in and of itself validate the whole thread of tradition. It is valid to argue for certain aspects of tradition, and it is of course absurd to suggest that it is all pseudo-things and nonsense, but it is even more absurd to suggest that the whole tradition should be conserved in its entirety in the face of such radical changes. A more charitable way to view these disagreements would be to call it a cultural conclave, where we appraise carefully which aspects of tradition are worth keeping and which things should be discarded. But even in this context, it is the conservatives who are more likely to refuse the open debate because, in their view, nothing is to be discarded, and for no other reason than that's just the way we've always done it. Chesterton's fence is cute and all, but it is only a simple metaphor in the face of a very complex system. Do not tell me that this defeats all suggestions of cultural change. And to the extent that here in the 21st century we are seeing the opposite, equally extreme response of all traditions must fall, it is only in the face of decades of conservative stonewalling and gaslighting. Change my mind! So these are the points that Arendt wishes to make regarding the difficulties of perceiving authority accurately, and she wishes to claim that, compared with these distinction-denying theories, the distinctions which I have proposed are unhistorical, if one understands by history not the historical space in which certain forms of government appeared, but the historical process in which everything can always change into something else, and these distinctions are anti-functional, insofar as the content of the phenomenon is taken to determine both the nature of the political body and its function in society, and not vice versa. These distinctions assume that in the modern world, authority has disappeared almost to a vanishing point, and this in the so-called authoritarian systems no less than in the free world, and that freedom is threatened everywhere, but abolished radically only in the totalitarian systems and not in tyrannies and dictatorships. I don't know about you, but I do see shades of Hobbes coming through here. Arendt references him fairly often, and she is certainly taken with his quasi-scientific treatment of politics, trying to bring human affairs into a system that can be perceived and, more importantly, intuitively communicated through clearly defined terms. This is the importance of distinctions as having inherent value, and distinctions are the parents of hierarchies. In my opinion, Arendt's explicit model of pyramid, destroy pyramid, and onion does not completely function in this way. The onion is just too different. That is why I try to place them in a consistent two-dimensional space, but I'm not pulling for my model either. Like Chesterton's fence, how accurate can these ideas possibly be? Arendt claims that her model is unhistorical and anti-functional compared to the orthodox liberal or conservative views with their various conflations of concepts. I take this to mean that they are unhistorical if history is a process and not a space, and they are anti-functional because the model determines the political and functional outcomes and not the other way around. Now, these two claims are also thrown in with entirely too much confidence for my liking. Taking the latter one first, how can we be sure that a pyramid suggests the political and functional outcomes? It is easy to say that a pyramid represents levels of power in society and that the gradient represents an orderly hierarchy, but if it were that easy, then we would already have a science of politics now, wouldn't we? Likewise, a pyramid can exist in a space, or it can develop as a process. What makes Arendt's models unhistorical in any important sense? Answers in the comments, please. Please. Regardless, this first part of the essay gives us the context for where she is going, and Arendt finishes with the clear questions that she hopes to investigate. Well, two of them are clear at least. What were the political experiences that correspond to the concept of authority and from which it sprang? What is the nature of a public political world constituted by authority? Is it true that the Platonic Aristotelian statement that every well-ordered community is constituted of those who rule and those who are ruled was always valid prior to the modern age? Or, to put it differently, what kind of world came to an end after the modern age not only challenged one or another form of authority in different spheres of life, but caused the whole concept of authority to lose its validity altogether? Or, to put it a third way, what changed about the world, and in particular the relationship between rulers and ruled, when the modern age began to undermine the tripartite model of religion, tradition, and authority? And with that, we have reached the end of part 1. Plato was the first historical philosopher and the foundation of Western philosophy itself. There were, of course, others before him, but in the end, all of the so-called pre-Socratics filter through Plato and Aristotle, and so it is there that Arendt always chooses to start. When it comes to authority as a concept, the actual word is Roman, for reasons which we will see, but it was the Greeks who first explored the idea, and the Romans who subsequently placed their foundation in Greek wisdom. Plato and Aristotle, like all philosophers, tried to make direct examples. They looked to the tyrant, the military commander, the head of the household, and the craftsman. On the first two, Arendt says, neither of these models could possibly serve the purpose. The tyrant remained a wolf in human shape, and the military commander was too obviously connected with a temporary emergency to serve as a model for a permanent institution. The tyrant in particular rules by violence and specifically tries to exclude the wider population from the public realm, which is incompatible with their freedom. And so, both Plato and Aristotle, albeit in very different ways, had to rely on examples of human relations drawn from the Greek household and family life. But actually, the head of the household was little better, because at home they rule largely as a despot. The members of the household are coerced, and thus they, and even the head of the household, are not free at home, because none of them are able to associate with other free-thinking individuals. The despot, unlike the king who is first among equals, was by definition vested with the power to coerce. Yet it was precisely this characteristic that made the despot unfit for political purposes. His power to coerce was incompatible not only with the freedom of others, but with his own freedom as well. Plato comes closest to defining authority in the Republic, where the reality of the polis is subjected to the utopian rule of reason through the philosopher king. But the problem is that this has nothing to do with the actual purpose of establishing the laws, and this purpose, which Arendt spends the next 4 pages on, is actually kind of horrifying. It is the control of the many by the few. The fatal resemblance between Plato's philosopher king and the Greek tyrant seems to have been recognized by Aristotle, but that this combination of reason and rule implied a danger to philosophy as well has been pointed out, as far as I know, only in Kant's reply to Plato. It is not to be expected that kings philosophize or that philosophers become kings, nor is it to be desired, because the possession of power corrupts the free judgment of reason inevitably. Although even this reply does not go to the root of the matter. Put simply, Plato realized that there was a conflict between the philosopher and the polis, and he saw this culminate in the death of his mentor Socrates, and so his philosophy became a kind of rebellion against the polis, and the laws were only meant to protect the philosophers. But this was still coercion, and so is the philosopher king just another tyrant? Well, Plato tried many ways to find a legitimate form of political authority, using such diverse models as shepherd and sheep, pilot and passengers, doctor and patient, and master and slave. In all these instances, either expert knowledge commands confidence so that neither force nor persuasion are necessary to obtain compliance, or the ruler and ruled belong to two altogether different categories of beings, one of which is already by implication subject to the other. This is the fundamental choice of Greek authority: technocratic authority or categorical authority. Aristotle, we shall see, chooses the latter, but Plato opts for the former. Of the master-slave dynamic, Plato says that the master knows what is to be done and the slave actually does it. He tries to ultimately separate authority from violence by making this distinction between knowing what to do, creating, and acting to do, making. Making always involves some violence towards the material. Creating, as a purely intellectual enterprise, does not. Note, Arendt's later work, The Human Condition, expands on action as a thing apart from work and labour in the social space, thus placing human creativity, the ability to birth new ideas and be changed by them, on a completely different level. We will go on to this more when discussing freedom, but at this point action is in the Platonic or colloquial sense of doing things, and not Arendt's later technical sense. All of Plato's examples of legitimate authority always come back to some form of expertise that the rulers had and the people did not. And he kept being drawn back to something like, the ruler knows what is to be done and gives his orders, while the subordinate executes them and obeys, so that knowing what to do and acting to do become different and mutually exclusive functions. However, this idea of expertise always brought him back to some kind of craft analogy, but the craftsman fashioned rations raw materials, an inherently violent act, and only more so when the raw materials turn out to be living creatures themselves. Arendt says, in the few instances where Plato shows a dangerous preference for the tyrannical form of government, he is carried to this extreme by his own analogies. Plato tried to avoid this regress by creating the ideal state. The coercion of the laws was rooted in the ideas perceived by the philosopher, but we must remember that the philosopher saw these ideas outside the human world. The parable of the cave is actually fundamental to Plato's political purpose, and as far as Plato was concerned, the sky of ideas contains by implication the cave and the world within, and so by inference can act as its standard. The philosopher is driven to leave the cave and witness the sky and the blinding sun, but not yet with the intent to exert control by making measurements. There is no authority at this stage. This only happens when the philosopher returns to the cave and experiences that other blindness of a return to the darkness. They are unable to explain what they have witnessed, and they have lost their orientation in the human world. Unable to communicate what they have seen, Plato says that actual physical danger is the inevitable result. But is it though? Plato, having seen the execution of his mentor by the polis, determined that it was hostile to the philosopher. Hardly surprising, but hardly conclusive either. Arendt herself concludes, "It is in this predicament that the philosopher resorts to what he has seen, the ideas, as standards and measures, and finally, in fear of his life, uses them as instruments of domination." The model of the craftsman gave Plato a reference for the existence of blueprints that existed prior to any man's knowledge. If the blueprint for a law exists prior to the need for law, then we may raise the idea of law over any one ruler's authority, and the ruler can be said to be merely accessing the ideal, creating, leaving it to the ruled to do what needs to be done, acting. Authority is an obedience in which men retain their freedom by making the law itself a ruler over all. Still despotic, but not a man, and so no man is dependent on any other man. Therefore, all are, to the extent the law allows, free. This is the sense of freedom which Arendt recognizes, and she does refer to it as an illusion on at least one occasion. It seems to be a kind of dynamic equilibrium of mutual freedom, similar to the theories of John Rawls, which we must imagine were emerging at around the same time. The trouble with coercion through reason, however, is that only the few are subject to it, so that the problem arises of how to assure that the many, the people who in their very multitude compose the body politic, can be submitted to the same truth. Here, to be sure, other means of coercion must be found, and here again, coercion through violence must be avoided if political life, as the Greeks understood it, is not to be destroyed. This is the central predicament of Plato's political philosophy, and has remained a predicament of all attempts to establish a tyranny of reason. In the Republic, the problem is solved through the concluding myth of rewards and punishments in the hereafter, a myth which Plato himself obviously neither believed nor wanted the philosophers to believe. In the Laws, Plato deals with the same perplexity, but in the opposite way. Here, he proposes a substitute for persuasion, the introduction of the laws, in which their intent and purpose are to be explained to the citizens. The idea of the myth and its importance in establishing so many of our modern models of authority is well attested. The second take in the Laws seems much more egalitarian and suggestive of the pyramid model of authority, where the equation that predicts its existence is easily explained. If we want to give Plato's authoritarianism its most charitable interpretation, he wishes to avoid the need for all members of the policy to be informed on every tiny issue, so that the ruler might be free to decide and the people are free not to have to decide, which, come on, is a thing. But this does not ultimately solve the problem of consent to authority, because an uninformed polity, by definition, cannot accept the basis of valid authority. This problem has only worsened over the centuries since Plato, especially during times where education was lacking, and the information age, which you might think could solve this problem, has really only papered over the cracks. According to Arendt, Plato was well aware of these shortcomings but was unable to find a non-violent form of authority without resorting to these inequalities. His goal was to find a way to make authority inherent to the relationship that existed between rulers and ruled, the hierarchy itself, necessarily prior to any order that the ruler may wish to give. This suffers from another difficulty. There will inevitably be a drift over time between the perspectives of rulers and ruled, changing the relationship until the actions of the former cease to benefit the latter. Plato's answer was to appeal to the ideal realm as the source of all good models, which could then function as standards, anchoring the pyramid at its apex. Good ideas, just like good chairs or good meters, are judged according to their ideal forms, but the application of these ideas is what dragged him back to political authority as some kind of skill, techne, and that put it squarely in the camp of making and therefore tainted by coercion and eventually violence. But Plato is not quite finished yet. It is also this contrast, idea versus application, which stands adjacent to the highest ideal, that which shines forth most. I don't really need to emphasize the Taoist parallel here, but I just did anyway. From Plato's perspective, this duality is expressed in the differing reactions of the philosopher, the pursuers of ideas, and the politician, the employers of techne. For the pure philosopher, it is only the true essence of an idea that recommends it, the beautiful. But for the philosopher who interacts with the polity, its applicability is what determines its fitness as a standard, the good. Arendt observes a real dichotomy in Plato's writings, but she identifies which one she believes is truly prior. We find in Plato either that this supreme idea is the beautiful, as in the Symposium or the Phaedrus, or that the highest idea is the idea of the good, as in the Republic. Obviously, Plato's choice was based on the current ideal of the kalon kagathon, but it is striking that the idea of the good is found only in the strictly political context of the Republic, when in fact it would appear that the idea of the beautiful as the highest idea reflected these experiences far more adequately than the idea of the good. The kalon kagathon is a previously existing ideal of gentlemanly conduct, similar in concept to Confucius' Zhenzi. In many parts of Plato's work, the highest ideal is that which shines forth most, which is much more akin to the beautiful, the philosopher's experience of the sky of ideas, than it is to the good, those ideas' suitability as standards for human life. And so Plato has just barely erected a narrow and rickety bridge between the beautiful ideal and the political good. It is as a defender of that which is truly beautiful that permits the philosopher to use violence in the application of authority. It is political self-defense. It is a very rickety bridge, and violence still seems to seep across somehow. Arendt suggests that Plato's final gambit is to restore some kind of human connection between the philosopher and the polity in a shared need to see. The philosopher was concerned to witness the sky of ideas, but the parable of the cave also makes clear that the dwellers in the cave are still interested in seeing, be it the shadows on the wall or the real objects in the light of the fire. Indeed, Plato assumes that those who inhabit the cave of human affairs are human only insofar as they too want to see, though they remain deceived by shadows and images. A real life, even that of a philosopher, is inexorably a life of speech and action. But even the many like to believe that they see and understand things clearly, rather than being animals who merely speak and act from automatic instinct. Hence, all people aspire to some level of philosophical contemplation and insight. For Plato, this is the final point which allows him to determine that those who are committed to reason and understanding, seeing, stand in authority over the realm of speaking and acting, doing. The rule of the philosopher king, that is, the domination of human affairs by something outside its own realm, is justified not only by an absolute priority of seeing over doing, of contemplation over speaking and acting, but also by the assumption that what makes men human is the urge to see. Hence, the interest of the philosopher and the man qua man coincide. Both demand that human affairs, the results of speech and action, must not acquire a dignity of their own, but be subjected to the domination of something outside their realm. Before I move on, I want to make a quick comparison of Plato's case to one chapter of the Tao Te Ching, titled Stilling War in Legg's 19th century version. The whole verse conjures up the Platonic predicament. What are weapons but the most extreme tools of coercion for the craftsman of an unruly populace? I will concede that in using this specific verse, I am kind of putting my finger on the scale of whether craft analogies necessarily entail violence, and I am returning to some of the metaphors that Plato explicitly rejected, the military commander. Bear that fact in mind, but the same ideas manifest at the political level. In the ideal world, all people would understand the sky of ideas, and if the sky of ideas is real, then the philosopher king is right, and their coercion is authority and not violence. Note that even the Tao Te Ching here says that those who follow the Tao avoid the use of weapons, which means that they must make use of other non-weapon means of organization. And even the Tao Te Ching makes explicit that the term legitimate use of force is a necessary one. But let us read the verse in question. Now arms, however beautiful, are instruments of evil omen. Hateful, it may be said, to all creatures. Therefore, they who have the Tao do not like to employ them. The superior man ordinarily considers the left hand the most honorable place, but in time of war, the right hand. Those sharp weapons are instruments of evil omen, and not the instruments of the superior man. He uses them only on the compulsion of necessity. Calm and repose are what he prizes. Victory by force of arms is to him undesirable. To consider this desirable would be to delight in the slaughter of men, and he who delights in the slaughter of men cannot get his will in the kingdom. On occasions of festivity, to be on the left hand is the prized position. On occasions of mourning, the right hand. The second in command of the army has his place on the left. The general commanding in chief has his on the right. His place, that is assigned to him as in the rites of mourning. He who has killed multitudes of men should weep for them with the bitterest grief, and the victor in battle has his place rightly according to those rites. Now, the nature of yin and yang is inherently hard to pin down, and this benefits from its own form of religious ambiguity, I am well aware. I'm not making any broad conclusions here, but these juxtapositions give us a few observations we can make. Yin is associated with the right and yang with the left, and each one is superior in different situations. Yang is superior in peacetime, and yin is superior in wartime. Yin is also associated with mourning and observation, which could be Apollonian reflection, and yang with violence and celebration, or Dionysian excess. In a broader Taoist context, yin is associated with femininity and surrender, whereas yang is concerned with masculinity and control. In the Arendtian context, it seems natural to assign the vita activa to the left and the vita contemplativa to the right. In these points, we can see some of the subtlety and contradictions of the relationship between Taoist thinking and the Western philosophical tradition. However, the main relevance of this chapter is that we can see the inherent conflict between ideas and techne, represented at its most extreme in war, where the yang tools of violence are used on the yielding or yin body of the polity, which, similarly to Plato's conception, is something concrete, vital, yang, and separate to the commanders in the abstract and sterile yin realm of ideas. As we saw though, Legg's translation implicitly allows that war is always a possibility, and perhaps we could claim that this allows the commanders to say that they are only necessary once war has been initiated. But we may further ask, what else drives a state to war other than conflicting ideas? And before you say resources, that includes ideas about how to use resources. All right. But furthermore, and independently of the relationship between yin and yang, what we also see here is a tension between the needs and rights of the soldiers and those of the commanders. From a Taoist perspective, the relationship between rulers and ruled is of a more complex nature, but remains of the same essential form. The aspect of war is only one incarnation of the Tao, and, as ever, to me it is worth noticing how well a Taoist model often maps over Western ideas from various ages, only without the baggage that will be piled upon it, just as similar baggage has piled up upon the Chinese tradition and many others. This is not to say that we can just get by on yin and yang and chill out, man. Additional rules and political structures will be required at any stage in history, but we should appreciate how this will be an ever-shifting optimization on certain fundamental underlying forces which we will almost certainly never understand. This is the postmodern challenge from a Taoist perspective, and I personally have not yet seen it answered. This dichotomy of Plato's between the contemplative mode of philosophy and the active mode of human affairs, and the Platonic focus on the former, became the source of authority for Western political thought. Because this schism was most clearly shown in the parable of the cave, people tend to connect it to the broader theory of ideas. But, says Arendt, the dichotomy of life does not require that the doctrine of ideas be accepted. She says that it depended much more upon an attitude which Plato expressed only once, almost casually in a random remark, and which Aristotle later quoted in a famous sentence of the Metaphysics, almost verbatim, namely that the beginning of all philosophy is thaumasein, the surprised wonder of everything that is as it is. More than anything else, Greek theory is the prolongation, and Greek philosophy the articulation and conceptualization of this initial wonder. Now, this is a pretty primal quote, and not for the first time, Arendt is identifying the very core assumptions of the whole basis of Western thought. The Greek thaumasein is indeed the root word for wonder and magic, and it refers to the quote, "Wonder is the beginning of wisdom." The idea was expressed in the Theaetetus and then by Aristotle in the Metaphysics, and thank you to the Stack Exchange user who posted these two quotes together in 2019. This is sometimes presented as Socrates encouraging the student of philosophy as being like a child in some sense. The sentiment is that one is only motivated to learn about the world if one is perplexed by something in the world, surprised by it, arrested by it in some way. These three words are all different but can be used in similar ways here. We could say that we are outraged if we want to be negative, but it is all ultimately wonder, a sense of surprise that motivates action. And if we accept that, then the last sentence of the previous quote is perhaps as close as you can get to a Western credo. We seek to extend indefinitely the experience of witnessing and wondering at the manifold forms of existence. But when you put it like that, doesn't it sound kind of generic? Like maybe the kind of thing you would hear from another world religion, like all of them? On the other hand, witnessing and wondering at the manifold forms of existence sounds really hard. This is not something that the majority of people can or should be forced to trouble themselves with, which, in fairness to Plato, is why he wanted the myth to function as it did. However, the ability to expand on that wonder into coherent forms is what therefore separates the few from the many, categorically, and this is where we come to Aristotle. Plato was the first to indicate a hierarchy between the vita contemplativa and the vita activa, but Aristotle was the first to make it an inherent quality of agents, an intellectual class of people. But Arendt says, the point in our context is not only that thought was supposed to rule over action, but by way of the bioi of identifying activities with ways of life, the principle of rulership was established between men as well. Historically, this became the hallmark of the political philosophy of the Socratic school, and the irony is that it was precisely this dichotomy between thought and action that Socrates had feared and tried to prevent in the polis. That final irony, I think, suggests that Socrates himself would have rejected a segregation of vita activa and vita contemplativa, advocating rather for a harmonic interaction of the two, assuming that such a thing was possible. The second attempt to establish a concept of authority, then, was Aristotle's. There was no tyranny of reason and no expertise that enables the ruler. Aristotle, as far as I can see, was the first to appeal for the purposes of establishing rule in the handling of human affairs to nature, which established the difference between the younger and older ones, destined the ones to be ruled and the others to rule. Younger and older is not strictly age-based here, it's a little bit more metaphorical, the majores and the minores. But Arendt says that we tend to ignore the fact that Aristotle contradicted himself earlier on in the Politics, saying that the polis is a community of equals for the sake of a life which is potentially the best. And no system in which there are natural rulers and ruled could possibly meet this definition. And this leads her to the Economics, which is a pseudo-Aristotelian treatise, but written apparently by one of his closest disciples. The essential difference between the political community and the private household is that the latter constitutes a monarchy, a one-man rule, while the polis, on the contrary, is composed of many rulers. In order to understand this characterization, we must remember first that the words monarchy and tyranny were used synonymously and in clear contradistinction to kingship. Second, the many rulers in the polis are the household's heads, who have established themselves as monarchs at home before they join to constitute the public political realm of the city. This is the problem we discussed above with household heads. They are effectively tyrants, whereas kingship is rather a political aspect of an already existing feudal system. A polis cannot exist without free agents. And how do these agents become free? Only the household community was concerned with keeping alive as such and coping with the physical necessities involved in maintaining individual life and guaranteeing the survival of the species. Necessity must be mastered before the political good life can begin, and it can be mastered only through domination. Hence, the freedom of the good life rests on the domination of necessity. Aristotle declares that political life cannot start at all until an individual has conquered the immediate needs of life, and it is this domination phase that contains violence, and so the subsequent political phase can command authority. The household heads who constituted the Greek polis thus accomplished their tyranny over necessity, and their slaves were just, the raw material or something. And by ruling over the household, they, and they alone, are thus able to engage in political life, and all others are excluded. This interpretation of political freedom once again entails some measure of violence. Gaining command over our physical necessities requires the domination of nature in some sense. Attaining comfort in ancient Greece required the holding of slaves to perform some of that labor. Today, energy is our slave, and it enables greater engagement with the polity by all individuals. Theoretically. However, energy is still of nature. Entropy is a thing, and the essential dilemma has not vanished. But Aristotle believes he has created some space between this domination, the violence, and political life. Domination and subjection, command and obedience, ruling and being ruled are preconditions for establishing the political realm precisely because they are not its content. Unfortunately, this space was something of an illusion, as Aristotle could not find a model for political authority that did not refer back to the earlier levels of the household. The example that Arendt focuses on is the distinction between young and old, which fails because young and old, as minores and majores, are distinguished from each other only by education, which is supposed to be apolitical. The function of education is assisting those who are being prepared for political life, not those who are already part of it. Any true adult education is either remedial or for the purposes of self-enrichment. This strong skepticism about education as political does require the strong definition of education as preparatory and not participatory. Thus, once education has been concluded and the individual has become political, it is not appropriate to use education in the public space. Politically, authority can acquire an educational character only if we presume with the Romans that under all circumstances, ancestors represent the example of greatness for each successive generation, that they are the majores, the greater ones by definition. And this is, as we shall see, how the Romans thought. However, Arendt does not think that we can go back to such a simple Roman concept of authority anymore, but she does say that Aristotle's example is of great relevance because it is true that the necessity for authority is more plausible and evident in child rearing and education than anywhere else. I will introduce a little bit of nuance here, but I'm not really disagreeing with Arendt. For me, the 21st century reality is that every teacher must be ready to be incorrect in real time. This is always going to happen unless they stay unreasonably far within the limits of their expertise, and thus teach their students to do likewise. This is not an indictment of the teacher. Education is not a simple robotic process. We might even say that this complexity is political, but Arendt discusses the problems with this in The Crisis in Education. Socrates was committed to the idea that he remained ignorant, and modern teachers would do well to follow his example and focus on the process rather than the result when they can. Now, I stand by the complexity I introduced there, but I do concede that Arendt touches on well-founded concerns. Not all educational systems are consciously designed, and education has certainly, at times, been used as a political tool. Wherever the model of education through authority, without this fundamental conviction of ancestor worship, was superimposed on the realm of politics, and this has happened often enough and is still a mainstay of conservative argument, it served primarily to obscure real or coveted claims to rule, and only pretended to educate, while in reality it wanted to dominate. The problem with any educational model of authority is that if education becomes political, well then that's called indoctrination. Arendt concludes by saying that in the end, all attempts at Greek political authority broke on the fact that there were no political experiences to draw from in making these comparisons. And this does seem to be a bit of an immovable object, because if this was the beginning of politics, where are such experiences supposed to come from? These various models, derived from either craftsman analogies or those of the household and the community, became the central core of Western political theory. It is precisely in this politically determined aspect that the philosophy of the Socratic school has exerted its greatest impact upon our tradition. Even today, we believe that Aristotle defined man primarily as a political being endowed with speech or reason, which he did only in a political context, or that Plato exposed the original meaning of his doctrine of ideas in the Republic, where, on the contrary, he changed it for political reasons. In spite of the grandeur of Greek political philosophy, it may be doubted that it would have lost its inherent utopian character if the Romans, in their indefatigable search for tradition and authority, had not decided to take it over and acknowledge it as their highest authority in all matters of theory and thought. But they were able to accomplish this integration only because both authority and tradition had already played a decisive role in the political life of the Roman Republic. The first half of this quote is essentially the strong claim which comes out of the past two sections. Our understanding of authority from the Greeks is distorted by the fact that we do not fully understand the context of those political roots. The rest of the quote really did give me a lot of trouble, but this is what I interpret it to mean. Even though Greek political authority was too great to be fully envisaged, it may have kept its utopian character if the Romans had not taken it on as their authority of theory and thought. But they could actually do this only because authority and tradition were already a part of the Roman political landscape. Also implied is that Greek theory lost utopian character in its acceptance by the Romans. Again, I'm not sure that I've fully passed this part well, but I take the idea of something being utopian to include the idea that it is inherently unachievable. I believe this is consistent with Arendt's other uses of the term, and it suggests that the complexity of the Greek philosophical system would have remained, as maybe Socrates would have preferred, a nebulous realm out of which truth may be distilled, but which cannot itself be called the truth, except that the Romans decided to make it exactly that. And the Romans needed to do this because the Romans already had an idea of what they wanted tradition and authority to be. And this is what we'll explore in part 4. The heart of Roman politics was the sacredness of foundation, and the Romans were so inextricably associated with their capital city that they could not conceive of the idea of the polis apart from Rome. Again, the idea of empire was much older than this, but the Romans took the foundation of a new body politic and made it into a literally religious event. The most deeply Roman divinities were Janus, the god of beginning, with whom, as it were, we still begin our year, and Minerva, the goddess of remembrance. The founding of Rome and the equally un-Greek experience of the sanctity of house and hearth form the deeply political content of the Roman religion. In contrast to Greece, where piety depended upon the immediate revealed presence of the gods, in Rome, religion literally meant relegare, to be tied back, obligated to the enormous, almost superhuman, and hence always legendary effort to lay the foundations, to build the cornerstone, to found for eternity. Thus, religious and political activity could be considered as almost identical. Arendt says that this foundation also offered the gods a permanent home within the polis, again in contrast to the Greeks. The Greek gods might fraternize with mortals, but their home was always distant. This Roman concern, almost an obsession with foundation, is the true root of our concept of authority. The word auctoritas derives from the verb augere, augment, and what authority, or those in authority, constantly augment is the foundation. Those endowed with authority were the elders, the senate or the patres, who had obtained it by descent and by transmission from those who had laid the foundations for all things to come, the ancestors, whom the Romans therefore called the majores. The connection to the founders, who by definition were already departed, and the presence of the ancestors became a vital part of Roman political experience. Arendt notes that this requires that authority is predicated on the past, but not necessarily on power. She quotes Cicero shortly after, "While power resides with the people, authority rests in the Senate," although I would like some details on exactly how that is supposed to work. To properly ground authority, Arendt looks at the difference between the auctor and the artifex, the author and the maker, and she gives seniority to the former. When a great work that augments the city is complete, to whom do we give our greatest esteem? Is it the author or the builder? It is the author, although who that is can vary depending on the occasion. Authority is therefore what will successfully augment the grand enterprise. As such, it is not the power that effects that augmentation, rather it is the sage advice that counsels it. This has a direct equivalent in the East in the form of Confucianism and related schools of thought. The essential point being that the process of improving society consists in taking close heed from the righteous ancestors who had laid down the best possible foundation. To be the progenitor of an idea is more praiseworthy as an augmenter of culture than to be one of those who brings that idea into reality. I'm inclined to quibble a bit on this binary distinction between author and actor. It must be more of a grey area, really. The engineer and the architect are at least partially authors of the greatness of a new theatre, for example. On the other hand, does humanity have a tendency, shared by philosophers and polity alike, of centralising the praise for social success towards an individual or a group? Yes, it does. So the essential idea does remain intact. It is original ideas that augment a culture, and to say that these do not often come from a single mind is to simply ignore the nature of human history. However, Arendt tries not to equate this relation with the master-subordinate relationship of Plato because the authority, the augmentation which the Senate must add to political decisions, is not power, it seems to us curiously elusive and intangible. Mommsen called it more than advice and less than a command, an advice which one may not safely ignore, whereby it is assumed that the will and the actions of the people, like those of children, are exposed to error and mistakes, and therefore need augmentation and confirmation through the council of elders. The authoritative character of the augmentation of the elders lies in its being a mere advice, needing neither the form of command nor external coercion to make itself heard. Which doesn't sound a million miles away from the master-slave relationship to me, and to be honest, once again we're dealing in the younger-older analogies to establish authority, which we talked about in part 3. There was also a religious aspect to authority mixed in with this sense of augmentation. The gods in their various portfolios show approval or disapproval of human decisions through their auspices and augury. This realm of the auspices is essentially the gods' authority over men, but all auspices that indicate the will of the gods are still ultimately tied back to Romulus' original mandate. So all authority derives from this foundation, binding every act back to the sacred beginning of Roman history, adding, as it were, to every single moment the whole weight of the past. Gravitas, the ability to bear this weight, became the outstanding trait of the Roman character, just as the Senate, the representation of authority in the Republic, could function, in the words of Plutarch, as a central weight like the ballast in a ship, which always keeps things in a just equilibrium. Fundamental reverence for the past is why the elders of a society become imbued with a sense of authority, less from their actual experiences and more from their proximity to the past, because the past itself is a source of authority. If one wants to relate this attitude to the hierarchical order established by authority and to visualize this hierarchy in the familiar image of the pyramid, it is as though the peak of the pyramid did not reach into the height of a sky above, or as in Christianity beyond the earth, but into the depth of an earthly past. First, let us note, this is not the same model of a pyramid that we saw above for political power distribution. Arendt signals this with the word familiar, but we should be clear not to conflate them. It is fine, even powerful as a rhetorical device, but let's be cautious of reading too much into repeated pyramid metaphors. Second, while it is true that the elders are closer to the past than the youngers, they have not actually grown any closer to the past over time. It is their effective cultural vector to the present that has actually changed relative to when they were younger. Thirdly, the metaphor of the ballast of the ship is another intuitively powerful image, the proper arrangement of things in the past, creating an evenly balanced ship of state as it sails on into the future. But there is an orthogonal move implied here again. If the ballast of a ship, or the foundation, weighs in the direction of the past, then the ship, according to the metaphor, travels not into the future, but perpendicular to that, i.e. into and out of the screen as shown here. I don't think this even means we have to discard the metaphor entirely, but insofar as we are using geometric analogies, it is important that we spot some of these things. Finally, something that features in the Roman model that has been culturally recessive, although not entirely absent in the West during the religious age, is this earthly basis for civilization. Arendt continues by saying, "It is in this primarily political context that the past was sanctified through tradition. Tradition preserved the past by handing down from one generation to the next the testimony of the ancestors, who first had witnessed and created the sacred fountain, and then augmented it by their authority throughout the centuries. As long as this tradition was uninterrupted, authority was inviolate, and to act without authority and tradition, without accepted time-honored standards and models, without the help of the wisdom of the founding fathers, was inconceivable, as long as this tradition was uninterrupted." Arendt is now going to draw yin out of yang, so to speak, but this is again a rhetorical device. The spiritual idea of tradition and authority, she says, is derived from the political realm, the wisdom of the elders, in much the same way as Plato's model of reason in politics is derived from the philosophical realm, the sky of ideas. But the historically all-important fact is that the Romans felt they needed founding fathers and authoritative examples in matters of thought and ideas as well, and accepted the great ancestors in Greece as their authorities for theory, philosophy, and poetry. So the Romans, and not the Greeks, made Greek theory authoritative. However, the fact that these concepts, foundation mythology and philosopher kingship, are derivative did not stop them from becoming dominant features of Western philosophy and Western politics, respectively. Arendt tries to be neutral regarding this derivativeness, but it is difficult not to perceive a pejorative character to the prose. What she says has been lost in both cases are the authentically political origins, the experience of foundation, and the conflict between the philosopher and the polis. And regardless of its source, the trinity of authority, religion, and tradition is what actually gave stability to the Roman project throughout its existence. An existence which she claims lasted long beyond the decline of the empire, when its political function was inherited by the Christian Church. The Church became so Roman that it made the death and resurrection of Christ the cornerstone of a new foundation, erecting on it a new human institution of tremendous durability. The Church was eventually able to overcome the anti-political and anti-institutional tendencies of the Christian faith. Yet, just as Plato's politicization of the ideas changed Western philosophy, so the politicization of the Church changed the Christian religion. The basis of the Church as a community of believers and a public institution was now no longer the Christian faith in resurrection or the Hebrew obedience to the commands of God, but rather the testimony of the life, of the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth as a historically recorded event. As witnesses to this event, the apostles could become the founding fathers of the Church, from whom she would derive her own authority as long as she handed down their testimony by way of tradition from generation to generation. And it was only once the Church had a means of transferring authority in this way that it truly became a religion in the ancient sense, as the Romans would have recognized it. These changes came as a direct result of Constantine's conversion, but it was Augustine who cemented it by tying back, religare, the notion of worldly authority to the resurrection, enabling the Roman political trinity to be installed into the Christian Church's operating system. Of particular note is that the Church at once adopted the Roman distinction between authority and power, claiming for herself the old authority of the Senate and leaving the power to the princes of the world. The great success of this fusion has been borne out by history, and Arendt puts it down to Christianity's being well able to subsume both the foundation mythology of the Romans and Platonic ideals into the first true idea of a transcendent authority. Arendt is fairly clear that something akin to the Roman political trinity is vital to the harmonious procession of human civilization, and the ability of the Christian Church to assume it from the Romans enabled the miracle of permanence to repeat itself once more. But the problem now comes as the modern world begins to observe the cracks in the Christian worldview, but with no continuity plan in place to allow this miracle to repeat itself again. The separation of church and state, on the other hand, far from signifying unequivocally a secularization of the political realm, and hence its rise to the same dignity that it had in the classical period, actually implied that the political had now, for the first time since the Romans, lost its authority, and so had lost that which had endowed political structures with durability, continuity, and permanence. The very idea of authority is now dependent on the religious superstructure, which is what maintains the Roman political trinity. But the religious superstructure became increasingly incompatible with the modern world. Religion has endured, however, because wherever the Roman model failed them, such as in regard to the transcendence of divine authority, Plato was always there to pick up the slack. To the extent that the Catholic Church incorporated Greek philosophy into the structure of its doctrines and dogmatic beliefs, it amalgamated the Roman political concept of authority, which inevitably was based on a beginning, with the Greek notion of transcending measurements and rules. General and transcendent standards under which the particular and immanent could be subsumed were now required for any political order, moral rules for all interhuman behavior, and rational measurements for the guidance of all individual judgment. There is scarcely anything that eventually was to assert itself with greater authority and more far-reaching consequences than the amalgamation itself. And so this amalgamation of Roman and Greek ideas that the Catholic Church established is what made it so philosophically resilient over the following centuries, and this is what we shall look at in Part 5. First, though, Arendt finishes off by claiming that nothing demonstrates the stability of the Roman political trinity more than the fact that the loss of any one of the parts makes the other two less secure. She gives 3 examples of these in the space of a single sentence. These examples should be independently investigated, but taking them at face value for now, Luther attacked church authority and therefore destabilized tradition and religion. Hobbes and the 17th century theorists removed tradition and so undermined authority and religion, and humanists in the modern age struggle to retain Western tradition in a world without authority and without religion. The amalgamation of Roman and Greek political concepts and the undeniable potency of the combination came together in the Christian interpretation of ancient wisdom. This is why Arendt makes abundantly clear from the start that she is only considering the Western tradition, which she traces to Plato. The Abrahamic tradition accepted these ideas into its political structure only later on. Implicit in this choice to focus on a single tradition of authority is the idea that there can be and are other models of authority, and this provides plenty of scope for a wider investigation. However, it is the Christian model of authority that we're looking at in this section. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, it was left to the Church to assume responsibility for the secular realm and thus become a temporal power. But this revealed a problem because separation was an integral part of the Roman political trinity. The religion and the authority should be kept distinct. This error began the process of dogmatization that was necessary in order to gain control over secular affairs. Foremost among these, and occurring at around the same time, was the formalization of the system of rewards and punishments, present in Plato, but now given a terrible legitimacy by the transcendent authority of the Church. But again, we are reminded that it was never intended literally. Plato invented a number of tales to conclude his political dialogues, usually after the argument itself had broken down, as in the Republic, or it turned out that Socrates' opponent could not be persuaded, as in the Gorgias. Of these tales, the myth of the Republic is the most elaborate and has exerted the greatest influence. Between Plato and the secular victory of Christianity, there was hardly an important discussion of political problems, except in Aristotle, which did not conclude with an imitation of the Platonic myth. And it is still Plato, as distinguished from the Hebrew and early Christian speculations about the afterlife, who is the true forerunner of Dante's elaborate descriptions. For in Plato, we find for the first time not merely a concept of final judgment, about eternal life or eternal death, about rewards and punishments, but also the geographical separation of hell, purgatory and paradise, as well as the horribly concrete notions of graduated bodily punishment. But these rewards and punishments were only ever intended as a means for the multitude to respect the authority that the philosophers had laid down. The point at stake was always the same. Truth by its very nature is self-evident and therefore cannot be satisfactorily argued out and demonstrated. Hence, belief is necessary for those who lack the eyes for what is at the same time self-evident, invisible, and beyond argument. Platonically speaking, the few cannot persuade the many of truth because truth cannot be the object of persuasion, and persuasion is the only way to deal with the multitude. Persuading the citizens of the existence of hell will make them behave as if they knew the truth. Christianity, as a political entity, blended Greek and Roman tradition and blurred many other lines besides, such as the distinction between Plato's philosophic teaching of the immortal soul, as in the Phaedrus, and his strictly political teaching of a hereafter with rewards and punishments, as in the Republic. However, they had some reason to think this way because Plato himself had confused the beautiful with the good in establishing his political philosophy in the first place. Arendt explicitly makes these confusions parallel to each other, and she goes on to claim in the light of this that Augustine, and possibly Tertullian before him, made clear the political purpose of Christianity in the same way that Plato made a revolutionary step against his predecessors in making his political purpose explicit. Indeed, Arendt says that it was Plato who coined the word theology in the Republic, and in the original context this theology was simply meant to be the standard of standards, a measurement of measurements, but a hereafter of rewards and punishments has the benefit of extending beyond death for crimes that are excessive or unpunished, and this is why Plato may have used it as a means for controlling the multitude. But Arendt is clear-eyed about the fact that Plato himself viewed this as merely a political device that enabled the few to rule the many. To be fair to the few, though, the truth under discussion here is more akin to a revelation in the religious sense, requiring some direct experience in order to reveal its self-evident nature, something that only witness to the sky of ideas is able to do. So, as we saw above, whether or not these ideas have genuine validity is irrelevant, and the few would never be able to persuade the many, no matter what their arguments, even if they are right. The only way then that the church could maintain its authority without the Roman foundation would be to fabricate some ethereal foundation which would convince the masses. But this turned out to be a tragic mistake. The introduction of the Platonic hell into the body of Christian dogmatic beliefs strengthened religious authority, but the price paid for this additional strength was that the Roman concept of authority was diluted and an element of violence was permitted to insinuate itself into both the very structure of Western religious thought and the hierarchy of the church. How high this price actually was might be gauged by the more than embarrassing fact that men of unquestionable stature, such as Tertullian and Aquinas, could be convinced that one of the joys in heaven would be the privilege of watching the spectacle of unspeakable sufferings in hell. And shortly thereafter, she provides this ultimate sobering thought. As far as religious thought is concerned, it certainly is a terrible irony that the glad tidings of the Gospels, life is everlasting, should eventually have resulted not in an increase of joy, but of fear on earth, should have made it not easier, but harder for man to die. And this is an insoluble problem. No matter what the political structure, short of an absolute hive mind, there is no way to exclude coercion comprehensively from the political realm. And coercion without understanding is violence, not authority. However, Arendt is equally uncertain about civilization without some form of control mechanism, pointing out that many of the post-Enlightenment revolutionaries still incorporated some kind of higher authority into their governing model as a religious underpinning for secular authority. They did this because the most significant consequence of the secularization of the modern age may well be the elimination from public life of the only political element in traditional religion, the fear of hell. We, who had to witness how, during the Hitler and Stalin era, an entirely new and unprecedented criminality was to invade the realm of politics, should be the last to underestimate its persuasive influence upon the functioning of conscience. It is not surprising that monarchs and dictators wanted to keep the religious basis of authority, but why would the leaders of the French and American revolutions endorse such a belief in future states? In the very age of enlightenment, that the men of the revolutions of all people should be so strangely out of tune in this respect with the general climate of their age was that precisely because of the new separation of church and state, they found themselves in the old Platonic predicament. When they warned against the elimination of the fear of hell, their words may sound with an almost prophetic ring in our ears, yet they were clearly spoken not out of any dogmatic faith in the avenging God, but out of mistrust in the nature of man. Here, Arendt seems to be leaning into the atheists cannot be moral angle, but she clarifies this concern. It was not an active function of atheism, rather it was an inherent consequence of the loss of authority that enabled these horrors to occur. This is concerning enough, of course, but it does not demonstrate that atheism is a problem per se. Atrocities are committed from what people are persuaded to do, and they occur when the opportunist takes advantage of a truth that can never be spoken, because the multitude, carried away by irresponsible tales of poets and storytellers, can be persuaded to believe almost anything, which was as true in the religious age as it is now in the secular age. Arendt is not surprised that these attempts to retain authority in the form of violence from the Roman political trinity and to use it in support of the new secular order failed. And furthermore, she wants to make clear that it was neither the rise of socialism nor Marxian critiques that killed them. So what was it that finally destroyed the efficacy of future states? In parentheses, Arendt claims that basically modern ideologies suit the modern age, so that compared with the various superstitions of the 20th century, the pious resignation to God's will seems like a child's pocket knife in competition with atomic weapons. The belief in future states is the political tool which Plato discovered and Augustine Christianized. However, she also concludes that this tool has become obsolete. Superficially speaking, the loss of belief in future states is politically, but not spiritually, the most significant distinction between our present period and the centuries before. And this loss is definite, for no matter how religious our world may turn again, the fear of hell is no longer among the motives which would prevent or stimulate the actions of a majority. It would do well to recall that Plato's device of how to persuade the multitude to follow the standards of the few had remained utopian prior to its being sanctioned by religion. Its purpose, to establish the rule of the few over the many, was too patent to be useful. For the same reason, the beliefs in future states withered from the public realm at once when their political usefulness was blatantly exposed by the very fact that they, out of the whole body of dogmatic beliefs, were deemed worthy of preservation. Arendt is brutally incisive here. The myth of Plato was too starkly manipulative to be genuinely politically effective, and the same is true of the fear of hell in the modern world, where nearly every other religious doctrine has been questioned and found wanting. Recall that utopian means unachievable, and just as Plato's theology was utopian before religion validated it, so now the belief in future states have become utopian in the modern world. And the clearest indication of this is that these beliefs, in hell and torment lest we forget, were the only ones that were deemed worthy of preservation. And while some might argue with that last and admittedly hyperbolic statement, the issue remains an important and undeniably political aspect of the Western tradition, and I see no answer forthcoming. Arendt opens the final section by claiming that all of the Greek analogies used to define authority and then canonized by the Romans have long since become empty platitudes. And so now, discussing authority leads us into a maze of abstractions because we have largely forgotten their necessary counterpart, the single most effective basis for political authority, the Roman idea of foundation. She then makes a curious claim. Greek concepts, once they had been sanctified by the Romans through tradition and authority, simply eliminated from historical consciousness all political experiences which could not be fitted into their framework. We don't really explore how they do this, but it doesn't matter because Arendt immediately goes back on it anyway. However, this statement is not entirely true. There exists in our political history one type of event for which the notion of founding is decisive, and there is in our history of thought one political thinker in whose work the concept of foundation is central, if not paramount. The events are the revolutions of the modern age, and the thinker is Machiavelli, who stood at the threshold of his age, and though he never used the word, was the first to conceive of a revolution. Arendt points out that Machiavelli has remained notorious, but that this has also led to continual misinterpretations of his work. When he insists that in the public political realm men should learn how not to be good, he of course never meant that they should learn how to be evil. There is scarcely another political thinker who has spoken with such vehement contempt of methods by which one may indeed gain power but not glory. The truth is only that he opposes both traditional concepts of the good, the Greek concept of good for, or fitness, and the Christian concept of an absolute goodness which is not of this world. It is important to note that Machiavelli does not completely discard these concepts of good. He considers them useful in the private realm, but in the public sphere they had no more place than their opposites. For Machiavelli, it was the virtù which was the specifically political quality of humanity, having neither the connotation of moral character, as does the Roman virtus, nor that of a morally neutral excellence like the Greek arete. But virtue does not exist in isolation. It is paired with fortuna, the situation into which an individual is delivered by the world, and virtue is their response. There is no virtue without fortuna, and no fortuna without virtue. The interplay between them indicates a harmony between man and the world, playing with each other and succeeding together. The interdependence of virtue and fortuna invokes yin and yang once again. I'm just saying. Also, we should reiterate that fortuna is not simply luck or chance, but rather the subtle state of a physical and social situation, integral with the purposeful actions of agents. Everything is a flux, constantly in motion. The contention of situation and purpose is what gives rise to the next situation, and hence the next purpose. But both are of equal, integral importance in the state of reality. Machiavelli was suspicious of all tradition in his time, but especially against the Catholic Church and its corruption, although he does acknowledge that corruption is inevitable when you mix the religious and political realms. He was led at last to the idea of foundation as a cardinal political act, and in this regard, violence is necessary in any act of political genesis. Arendt references in particular the Discourses, Book 3, Chapter 1, which is titled If one wishes a sect or a republic to live long, it is necessary to draw it back often towards its beginning. Machiavelli talks plainly that all political institutions inevitably become corrupt, and so, if they are to survive, they must return to their beginning. But as to sects, these renewals are also seen to be necessary by the example of our religion, which would be altogether eliminated if it had not been drawn back towards its beginning by St. Francis and St. Dominic. For with poverty and with the example of the life of Christ, they brought back into the minds of men what had already been eliminated there. Their new order of faith ensures the dishonesty of the prelates and of the heads of the religion do not ruin it. This could very easily be interpreted as a simple conservative argument to return to tradition, but remember the nature of fortuna. When Machiavelli talks of a return to the beginning, it is to that which originally made the institution great in the first place, but that occurred in another time and place, with a different network of virtue and fortuna, and so the political experiences which restore the institution will not be identical to those which established it. Machiavelli also seems to implicitly notice that the Christ-like efforts of St. Francis and St. Dominic had a potentially damaging effect on the public space. Living still in poverty and having so much credit with peoples in confessions and sermons, they gave them to understand that it is evil to say evil of evil, and that it is good to live under obedience to them, and, if they make an error, to leave them for God to punish. As much as the meek shall inherit the earth does tap into something in the Christian message, it also does seem to engender a certain docility of spirit in response to evil. Regardless, Arendt says that it was this that led him independently back to Rome. Respect for these religious forces and contempt for the church together led him to certain conclusions about a basic discrepancy between the Christian faith and politics that are oddly reminiscent of the first centuries of our era. Machiavelli's own exploration of the Roman political foundation is the greater because it is separated from the weird interconnectedness of Greco-Roman Christian ideas that we discussed above. He determined that the foundation of a state could happen spontaneously, and Arendt notes that, as the very first to use the term the state, he is rightly regarded as the creator of the concept. But what of revolution? What is even more striking, though less well known, is that Machiavelli and Robespierre so often seem to speak the same language. When Robespierre justifies terror, the despotism of liberty against tyranny, he sounds at times as if he were repeating, almost word for word, Machiavelli's famous statements on the necessity of violence for the founding of new political bodies and for the reforming of corrupt ones. And in comes Robespierre out of nowhere with the assist! Like the Romans, Machiavelli and Robespierre felt that founding was the central political action, the one great deed that established the public political realm and made politics possible. But unlike the Romans, to whom this was an event of the past, they felt that for this supreme end, all means, and chiefly the means of violence, were justified. This received its inherent plausibility from the underlying argument. You cannot make a table without killing trees. You cannot make an omelette without breaking eggs. You cannot make a republic without killing people. In this respect, which was to become so fateful for the history of revolutions, Machiavelli and Robespierre were not Romans, and the authority to which they could have appealed would rather have been Plato, who also recommended tyranny as the government where change is likely to be the easiest and most rapid. So revolution is driven not only by the Roman idea of political foundation, but also the more Platonic notion of the craftsman, how to make a new nation. And, as with any act of making, this could not be done without some violence to the raw materials. This is the true reason that Machiavelli is the father of modern revolutions, because he was the first to suggest that this could be done proactively in the construction of new states. But of course, it delivers us right back into the original Platonic predicament. Unless it is recognized that the Roman pathos for foundation inspired them, it seems to me that neither the grandeur nor the tragedy of Western revolutions in the modern age can be properly understood. Arendt asserts that the fall of the Roman trinity of tradition, religion, and authority is what has led to the so-called decline of the West. And if so, then the various modern revolutions are different ways to attempt to somehow repair that foundation and tie back to the lost basis of Western authority. But Arendt says that this is impossible. The Roman basis on which the public space depends cannot exist anymore, and these revolutions were therefore doomed to fail. Except one. The only successful revolution, she says, was the American Revolution. The Founding Fathers, as characteristically enough we still call them, founded a completely new body politic without violence and with the help of a constitution. And this has endured to the present day, in spite of the fact that the modern world has nowhere else produced such extreme expressions in all non-political spheres of life as it has in the United States. This is where Arendt displays a few blind spots to my mind, although of course certain things were more casually accepted at that time. I think it's fair to say that she signed on to the idea of the United States as a true new foundation, although I do not think that the idea of US civil religion would have been appealing to her in its modern form. There was some plausibility to the US being the world leader in multiculturalism at the time that Arendt wrote. I would say less so now, and don't worry, we are coming to those blind spots. Now, the suggestion that the US was founded without violence is clearly laughable from a 21st century standpoint, but Arendt does have a plausible perspective, and we should not miss any genuine points in the rush to be pompously superior, because that is a thing we sometimes do. So, I do think that the US does constitute a new foundation, but one that, like Arendt, failed to anticipate the information age. And honestly, who else could have done? On the issue of violence, slavery, in the first place, could at least be argued by Arendt as having that character of the necessary domination of material needs before entering into the public space. I don't think that really makes it any better from a pure humanist perspective, but it is a coherent idea. In the second place, the fact that Arendt simply overlooks the displacing and suppression of Native American culture is, I would say, based on a colonial-era oversimplification of the virtue spectrum of cultural tradition, if that makes any sense. I.e., we assumed that we knew how and what to judge when we judged that European culture was superior to Native American culture. And then smallpox kind of made the question moot. And yes, I know I've oversimplified a lot there. The Founding Fathers would not have been able to engage then in the creative act of foundation if they were not wholly supported by their holdings and able to regard this new world as manifestly theirs, a raw material for them to shape. I will not speculate on the reason for Arendt's oversight. Whatever the reasons, it raises questions, though, over her following claim that the non-violent nature of the revolution has contributed to the stability of the American project. But she does suggest several other reasons, too. It may also be that the Founding Fathers, because they had escaped the European development of the nation-state, had remained closer to the original Roman spirit. More important, perhaps, was that the act of foundation, namely the colonization of the American continent, had preceded the Declaration of Independence, and thus needed only to regulate rather than create a body politic. But that body politic is now beginning to schism, isn't it? Although we can forgive Arendt for not seeing this in the 1950s. Even if we choose to overlook the violence, however, we must see that the early United States merely used its vast space and resources to avoid the fact that their constitution did not in fact solve the problems of political authority. Like a ×10 speed run of the old world, different expressions of human culture spread across the land, and unilateral interference was not only unwelcome, but also impractical. The nascent US provided space and energy to indulge the founding of an unlimited number of different ways of life, laying the groundwork for obstinate entitlement. I mean rugged individualism. However, just like the rest of the world, the United States is lately realizing that the bubbles of culture and energy will eventually infringe upon each other, and their attempt at a new foundation is as empty as the old Roman model in the modern era. However that may be, revolutions, radical breaks with tradition, appear in our context as events in which the actions of men are still inspired by and derive their greatest strength from the origins of this tradition. They seem to be the only salvation which this Roman Western tradition has provided for emergencies. The fact that not only the various revolutions of the 20th century, but all revolutions since the French have gone wrong, seems to indicate that even these last means of salvation provided by tradition have become inadequate. Authority, as we once knew it, which grew out of the Roman experience of foundation and was understood in the light of Greek political philosophy, has nowhere been re-established, either through revolutions or through the even less promising means of restoration, and least of all through the conservative moods and trends which occasionally sweep public opinion. For to live in a political realm with neither authority nor the awareness that the source of authority transcends power and those who are in power means to be confronted anew without any of the traditional defences by the elementary problems of human living together. What do I take from this essay? Arendt goes back and forth somewhat, but she does ultimately seem firm that some kind of political authority is necessary, whatever the source, and given that she seems to discard the belief in future states for both practical and meta-ethical reasons, we are left with the Roman idea of foundation. This is what all revolutions attempt, with varying degrees of success, and why, if a solution is to be found, then it will have revolutionary character. That said, she does not advocate for anything too radical on the basis of her equally strong conviction of respect for the past. One might say that we are between past and future, Way back at the start of the essay, Arendt took the time to dissemble on the nature of the Roman political trinity. Religion is not faith, tradition is not the past, and authority is not the human capacity to build order. If you want my opinion, and if you are still here, I assume that you do, she is trying to give enough conceptual space for some new kinds of political experience to be articulated. If you want to ask me what kinds of new political experiences this might be, I'd say this is a fair question, and honestly I'm not sure that I can give a good answer. But, for example, a new fusion of socialism with markets and the attendant group of political mindsets that would foster such a system.
As you can see from the footnote, I chose a bad example here, but what I am attacking is the hyperbolic level of contempt that is levelled at, say, philosophical Marxism, when all of its 20th century failures were based on its conflict with the very model of failing authority which we have been discussing. And if you have watched Tradition and the Modern Age, you will know that Arendt herself thought that many of the ideas attributed to Marxism today, for example, socialised men, were simply implied from the classical economists that capitalism itself was based upon. As it goes then, I am not ready to slavishly sign on to the modern rejection of anything that is associated with old beardy. And on that note,
maybe a good start would be if we could discuss broader political change without resorting to hyperbole and hand-wringing. In the light of Arendt's discussion, let me briefly answer the question she posed at the end of part 1. What are the political experiences that correspond to and give rise to authority? In the Western context, the political experiences that give rise to authority are those that can be associated with the idea of expertise, of having somebody who knows what needs to be done. Sadly, it is these self-same experiences that draw us back to the metaphor of the craftsman, and therefore violence. Arendt does not fully resolve this here, but this Platonic predicament is certainly one of her foundational political concepts. What is the nature of a public political world constituted by authority? In an authoritarian society, the polity engage in augmentation of tradition through the medium of the creative act. Culture is preserved and added to and becomes the locus of history around which we operate. This cultural space is what allows remembrance and traces an orderly linear development through time. Probably not in a pyramid, but that is our metaphor here. But Arendt ultimately seems pessimistic about the survival of authority because of the uncontrollable waves of mass society and our loss of a firm pier to fix ourselves to. The ship of state seems destined to have no captain, and other mixed nautical metaphors. What about the world changed when the modern age began to undermine the tripartite model of religion, tradition, and authority? Politically, Machiavelli, through his critique of the Catholic Church, enabled the idea of a revolution, a new foundation. In this sense, he was beyond the Romans, for whom there could be only one foundation. But this innovation was also hubris, for it was this commitment to the creative act of a forward-looking foundation that led Machiavelli and the later revolutionaries to accept the need for violence as a basis for political change, culminating in Marx's choice to make it an explicit part of the historical process. So, do we stand at the end of a specific Western Platonic tradition of authority? As always, it would be easy to cop out here with some form of yes and no. However, arguably, this issue is one on which the very nuance of all other political issues hangs. If we don't have a clear answer on the question of authority, then all other political answers are directly called into question. This is, in many ways, the very problem that conservatives worry about, the doom of unrestrained freedom, the postmodern relativistic morass. And so it is with sadness and some trepidation that I say, yes, political authority is over, and to some extent this is a Western problem. Political authority still seems to be quite robust throughout Asia, and as fractious as ever throughout the rest of the world. The key word, though, there is seems. Even in Asia there is civil disobedience, and to the extent that it is more easily quelled, it does often come with a certain amount of violence. The Platonic predicament was also discovered in Asia, but the more communitarian mindset of both Indian and Chinese traditions led to different perspectives. Returning to the West, I say again, yes, Western authority is failing because in a more individualistic culture, it is becoming increasingly clear that no individual is or can ever be worthy of the level of authority that a modern state allows. There are only human beings and no divine commands. However, the building and sustaining of structures requiring a foundation does allow things that have been agreed to work should be able to function without the need for constant executive decisions, and thus the bureaucracy was born. This was the beginning of everything that could be called a state, but it is entirely dependent on one thing: regulation. More people, bigger state, more regulation. I'm sorry, get over it. But that alone will not solve the problem, because all regulations are written and administered by human individuals. And so all of the problems of executive authority can be seen in the bureaucratic model too. Conservatives may claim, a la Hobbes, that the more authoritarian model is now vindicated, because either way there will be individual failures, but at least an authoritarian government can actually govern more effectively. This is perhaps true, but it all comes down to how they want to govern, doesn't it? Hobbes conceived the Leviathan as a single executive power that was maximally effective as the brain of the body politic, and he considered that concentrating power in a single individual was best because then there was no way for the executive power to come into conflict with itself, which is how bureaucratic inefficiency begins. But there is one problem with this model. Human beings have this thing called a psychology, and everyone's psychology is different and has a differently skewed perspective on the world. In essence then, the executive power does come into conflict with itself. It's just that this conflict happens entirely within the head of the sovereign, where no one, not even the sovereign themselves, can see. So no, I don't think that authoritarians can claim Occam's razor on the issue of executive power. This is why Arendtian common sense, which we have discussed throughout the series, is an essential quality in genuine politics, as opposed to petty partisan power play. And even if it was possible for one person in Hobbes's time to have a truly complete concept of humanity, it wasn't, but let's assume, then it certainly is not now, and raising the few up above the many as the authority on matters of state is only likely to degrade their common sense further, and so the priorities of the rulers and the ruled inevitably begin to drift apart. And so that is Arendt's answer on the question, what is authority? I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the essay, and I hope I've been able to spin a coherent narrative for you if you're not going to read the essay. However, if you are interested, I do encourage you to read Arendt herself. She has much more to say on this in all of her body of work. As for me, why not like the video if you've enjoyed it? Thanks for listening, and bye for now.